They told us it was routine. That line still sits heavy in my mouth, because routine is not how you remember the shape of a thing that changes you. What U.S. soldiers discovered during a classified Appalachian mission in 1979 was buried, not just under dirt and concrete, but under orders, signatures, and decades of silence. I was there. I carried the weight of that day for years, until I couldn't anymore. My name is Ethan Ramirez. In the late summer of '79, I was a sergeant assigned to an engineering and security detail attached to a small special projects unit at Kirtland. We were a few hands and a couple of trucks. Me, Sergeant Javier Luna running perimeter security, Private Miguel Torres on comms and logistics, David Ortega driving our transport, and a handful of others shuffled in for the work detail. We weren't intelligence operators. We weren't scientists. Our job was simple on paper. Respond to an engineering assessment request at a remote, classified facility in the Appalachian foothills, confirm structural integrity, and report back. The order came down as a structural safety check. It was labeled as routine in the communiques I signed. The word routine got stamped on our file that morning and followed us like a shadow. We left Kirtland early. The convoy moved before the sun, tires humming on a back road that narrowed into a gravel track. The Appalachian ridgeline cut the horizon into teeth. Fog clung low in hollows, and the air smelt like damp leaves and diesel. The facility sat where a service road dead-ended against a chain-link fence and an unmarked gate. There were no welcome signs, only a keypad, a badge reader, and a single guardhouse with a man who did not look up from his thermos until Colonel Marcus Hayes clicked off the badge reader and waved us through. The approach stuck in my mind because it was wrong in small ways. Too clean, too rehearsed. The perimeter had new barbed wire, freshly tamped earth around old concrete. The access road had been resurfaced in places that led nowhere. We passed maintenance crews who gave us curt nods, then a truck with men in lab jackets who loaded crates with white stenciling. Nobody met our eyes. That kind of organized avoidance is different from secrecy. It's containment behavior. You can smell it if you've spent enough nights guarding a perimeter. We were briefed in a small room that could have been mistaken for an office if not for the reinforced door labeling and the security badge reader on the outside. A map lay on the table when we walked in, a schematic of 5 levels, scaled and neat, inked with corridors and chambers. The top 3 were listed with familiar labels: storage, utilities, research annexes. Levels 4 and 5 were redacted in places, black rectangles over text, lines that stopped abruptly. Level 5 was not present on the public schematics at all.
We were told Level 5 was sealed, inaccessible to standard visits, and only opened under direct, written order from headquarters. Colonel Hayes spoke and gave us a cover story: structural weaknesses at depth, potential for subsidence. Dr. Alan Cortez and Dr. Samuel Moreno sat to the side, in civilian coats despite the chill. Cortez's expression was tight, professional. Moreno looked tired in a way that felt older than his years. The decontamination protocol was standard for classified sites: disposable suits, boot covers, taped seams. Nobody joked about the hoods. The airlock didn't smell like anything at first. It always surprises me how quiet those systems are when they want to be. The suction of seals, the whisper of fans. Our environmental monitors were clipped to belts, little boxes that chirped green in normal atmospheres. They were green when the elevator door swung shut and the cables hummed.
There were handrails bolted into the rock. The air changed as soon as we stepped in. It grew colder and carried a faint chemical tang, like someone had mixed antiseptic with wet earth. We paused there. That was the point where routine became opt-in. The mission brief had not authorized the opening of unmapped passages. Rules are rules for a reason, but rules also assume paperwork tells the whole story. I looked at Javier. His jaws set in a line I knew by then meant he was calculating risk. He wasn't the type to step off a cliff without a plan, but he also wasn't the type to leave a potential structural hazard uninvestigated. He said quietly, "We document and proceed." "Colonel Hayes was explicit," Miguel said, voice clipped. He thumbed the edge of his radio like it was a talisman. "Sealed levels off limits." "Sealed to whom?" I asked. It came out sharper than I'd meant. The question hung in the concrete thick air like a thrown stone. We did what we always did. We recorded, we photographed. I logged the time as accurately as I could, 0913 local. You learn to measure events with as many minor anchors as you can. The cameras were standard issue, their data later taken, but at the moment they felt like a thin lifeline to accountability. The passage led into a space that had clearly been cut out after the original build. Pipes ran new along one wall. Oddly, some terminated in short stubs that chewed off into nothing. There were fasteners that looked as if they'd been installed by people who needed them to be invisible to cursory checks. On one side, someone had bolted in brackets for what might have been shelving, and on the shelf were crates with hazard marks and white labels that had been intentionally blurred with a solvent. At the end of the passage, the concrete opened into a series of doors, each with a small observation port and reinforced framing. The doors were labeled not with numbers, but with a single letter and a dash: C3, C4, C6. There were also stenciled warnings: biohazard, containment. The sight of that label is the kind of thing you don't forget. You get used to seeing biohazard on the outside of lab lockers and barrels, but not on doors hidden inside an anonymous corridor. The port on the nearest door was cloudy with condensation, and something dark moved on the other side. I remember that because my first reaction was technical. Condensation means temperature differential. Something inside was cooler, and it was generating humidity relative to the corridor. My second reaction was human. There was movement. Whatever was inside could move. We called the rest of the team forward and waited for orders. We were supposed to radio up, request instructions, and stand by. Colonel Hayes appeared at the end of the corridor like a man summoned by the same small alarm. He didn't look surprised, only practiced. Dr. Cortez and Dr.
Marino arrived tucked behind him with clipboards and faces that tried to approximate neutrality and only partially succeeded. Cortez did most of the talking. He explained in measured tones that the rooms were containment chambers. He used words like specimen custody and biosecure transfer, and assumed the authority that comes from knowing how to speak without answering. Moreno, who I later learned had begged for disclosures and then regretted the wish, diverted his gaze and let Cortez steer. He touched the outer glass of the port, as if to reassure himself of its integrity. "These chambers are legacy containment," Cortez said. He didn't say who these belonged to. He offered us reassurances that were formulous: maintained HVAC, negative pressure, separate exhaust. He told us that the records showed long-term storage of biological samples of unknown origin, and that any access required a chain of command exception. He also told us, in a voice that suggested the presence of higher directives, that we were to document structural concerns and leave containment matters to his team. None of that was a denial. It was an attempt at control. Redirect the question toward the task the soldiers were assigned and away from the people behind the panels. There's a technique to it. Give enough information to satisfy protocol auditors while withholding the parts that would make conscience uncomfortable. We were allowed to inspect the exterior frames, the camber of the doors, the hinges and their welds. We took photos, measured gap tolerances, and logged materials. On the observation port, I could make out shapes pressed near the glass. At first, they looked like mannequins. Then, under the angle of the inspection light, they blinked. You learn a lot about people by watching how they witness an impossible thing. Miguel went quiet and began to scribble, notepad moving fast. Javier breathed through his mouth and tightened his grip on the rail. David swore softly under his breath, a reflexive, cultural thing, not intended for anyone but himself. I felt my hands damp on the tool. I kept my face neutral because that is what a sergeant does: hold the normal line so others can see safety in your normalcy. "Stay back," Cortez said, calm as instruction. "Do not attempt to interact." We didn't. We cataloged. We observed. The port clouded as something leaned close to the glass. It had features that imply a head, a neck. It was smallish, proportioned differently than a human. Its skin caught the light in a way that made it appear translucent. Its eyes reflected the inspection lamp like dark coins. When its gaze met mine, I'm not going to pretend I understood anything beyond the feeling, an instant of recognition. Not hostile, not friendly, just assessing. The notion that something behind reinforced glass could register me in the same way I register another human being is the memory that has kept me awake at night.
"Subject in C6 appears responsive," Moreno said. His voice had that thin, brittle quality that people get when they know what they are witnessing is outside their mental models. He read instruments: thermal, oxygen differentials, conductivity. He scribbled numbers, then scratched them out. He looked at me like someone making an apology. "We don't know the origin," he said. "We catalog them as specimens of unknown biological properties." "Catalog them how?" Javier asked. His voice held the hard edge of someone who worries about procedure, because procedure is the only thing standing between order and chaos. "For what? For containment? For study? Who authorized long-term storage?" Cortez leaned in. "Authorization predates most of your files," he said. "These are legacy assets. The project falls under a compartmented directive. We keep them controlled for the safety of the public and for ongoing research."
Assets, Miguel muttered, hands folded white on the notepad. There was a distance in his mouth that I'd seen before, disbelief folded into a soldierly understanding of hierarchy. The language of containment had turned living things into departmental inventory. We spent the first half-hour arguing about access in small procedural ways while the instruments ticked. The environmental monitor that had been green at the elevator had turned yellow. It climbed to orange in jerks over the next 20 minutes. That color change isn't cinematic, it's mechanical. Green is nominal. Yellow means out of range but not catastrophic. Orange is urgent. The monitor flashed, then chirped. We locked it. Someone on the team suggested recalibration. Cortez said the monitors were set to detect baseline air chemistry, and that the increase corresponded to metabolic activity in the closed chambers. He called it respiratory byproducts. That word, respiratory, landed in us like a hand slamming on a conference table. There were living processes down there. We asked for documentation. Cortez provided forms scrubbed of names, stamped with dates that began in 1979 and carried forward like a ragged seam into the present. He said they had maintained the facility in off-roster mode after a retrieval event decades earlier. He hinted, carefully, that there had been incidents before our arrival, places where transfer protocols had failed and had cost them control. He spoke as one would speak of a surgical scar, functional and regrettable. I remember thinking about the date on the forms, how it matched in the logs with a small notation that, when I asked about it, Cortez described as an early recovery. He spoke of recovered biological material and containment initiated. When you hear the same terminology applied to a lab sample and to a living thing, you realize bureaucracies have a flattening effect. They turn the animate into records. We moved deeper because we had to. Our mandate was structural integrity.
If these chambers existed and exerted load on supporting beams, then we were obligated to find out whether the seals and supports had been compromised. That decision was procedural, defensible. It was also the pivot where discretion runs into morality. You can follow orders and be technically correct, but still be implicated in a larger wrong. As we worked, I kept scanning the observation windows. The shapes behind them shifted. Some of the chambers appeared empty. Others were populated by beings at various degrees of wakefulness. One chamber had a subject curled in the fetal position, breathing shallowly. Another had a figure sitting with its knees drawn up, its head cocked like an animal listening for the hunt. The subject in C6, the one that had fixed its gaze on me, watched even as we measured, as if cataloging us back. There was a hum in the walls. HVAC systems do that at scale, a constant low frequency that is easy to ignore until someone turns it up. When the hum crescendoed, the lights above one of the long corridors lurched and then dropped, plunging us into a red emergency glow. Red strobes painted everyone in slices of human shadow. The environmental monitors started to beep faster, a staccato of warnings. It was like the building was clearing its throat before saying something big. The red lights are the sound that gets into your gut. You cannot mistake them for anything else. They mean an emergency protocol. Cortez barked, suddenly stripped of his clinical calm. "Initiate transfer protocol," he said. He had a level to his voice I'd only ever heard when someone is about to make a hard choice. He didn't make the choice himself. That was reserved for command. We were told to stand back as technicians readied moving apparatuses we hadn't seen in the schematic. There were gurneys with clamps, sealed containment bags, mobile cooling units. Someone rolled what looked like refrigerated tanks on tracks. It was a transfer in miniature, designed to move something that must not touch the open air for long. Dr. Moreno stayed by the observation port and kept scanning. His hands trembled a little when he wrote down oxygen percentages. "Why now?" Javier asked. He had the look of a man who wanted to see the entire chessboard before moving his piece. Cortez glanced at the monitors, at the red glow, at the data he kept under his arm. "There are anomalies in the filtration," he said. "We caught a drop in negative pressure on the eastern array. It's isolated, but we don't take chances." That was a careful phrase. We don't take chances. It rationalized what came next as precaution. It became the justification for a logistical decision that would echo beyond our shift. They opened one of the chambers for transfer. It wasn't something we were supposed to see. The real action occurred in the sealed bay adjacent to the corridor, a small room accessed by a series of interlocking doors.
The bay smelled cold and metallic, smelled of plastic and antiseptic. The chamber door hissed open with a pneumatic sigh. A pair of technicians in full containment suits slid a tank out on a track. Inside the tank, visible through a curved window that fogged almost immediately, was a small figure wrapped in the translucent membrane, limbs tucked close. It was smaller than a human adult. Its skin had a sheen that caught reflections. When they eased it into the transfer cradle, it stirred, and its eyes opened. This time, there was no mistaking cognition. The eyes moved in a deliberate scan. They found the opening in the bay. They stopped on me, on my face, on the strap of my pack. For a heartbeat, a fraction that expanded and stretched beyond its chronological size, the thing looked at me and did something that had nothing to do with instinct. It recognized something. Whether it recognized me or recognized the sound of human presence or the pattern of heat, I can't say. All I know is the intensity of that look, appraising, not terrified, not pleading, just curious in a way that felt like a judgment. Miguel, who'd been silent for the whole time, let out a breath like a soft animal sound. He covered his mouth with his hand. Javier shifted his weight, the way soldiers do when they want to be ready to move but don't yet want to show emotion. The transfer went as these things do, methodical and urgent. They rolled the cradle down the track, sealed the interlocks, and moved the tank into a convoy of mobile containment modules stacked by the elevator. Cortez barked orders that unrolled into practice motions. Moreno worked at the console like a man who had memorized the fall of every button. The environmental monitor toggled between orange and red. At the command level, things turned brisk. We were given a mission pivot then. Orders came down from Colonel Hayes after a whispered, closed-door call with men on encrypted channels. He told us, with the directness of someone carrying authority, that we were to facilitate a transfer of specimens to an off-site secure location. The phrasing was clean. Temporary relocation due to compromised structural integrity. He said it as if it were an engineering term. He meant it as a containment term. The human parts of us, the part that keeps a ledger of moral choices and tally of small violences, bristled. We were soldiers trained to follow orders, but we were also human beings who had watched shapes with eyes like thinking things lean to the glass and look at us as if we were the new unknown. As the convoy of containment modules rolled toward the lift, one unit began to emit a high keening from its pressure gauges. The engineers stopped. A toenail of panic pulled across the room. Moreno's face drained further. Cortez cursed under his breath. The ambient hum that had been steady became layered with alarm tones, first a soft chime, then a rising warble. The transfer cradle buckled.
The unit that had the small figure, that had looked at me, developed a hairline fracture in its outer composite shell. It was not a clean break. It was a tear that spiderwebbed like broken glass. There was a chemical smell that put the cough in our throats. The environmental monitors hopped to red and then to alarm. The doors that had been sealed began to cycle autonomously, a safety lock trying to close a gap, and somewhere a panel blew a fuse with a sound like a gunshot. Containment breach, someone said. The word is clinical and precise. A breach is not the same as an outbreak. It implies a hole in procedure, a failure to keep a barrier intact. But the moment you say it in a room full of breathing things, you stop being clinical and start being human. The technicians reacted. Men in dark uniforms came running, their faces set in office-flat grimness. Security shifted into a hard mechanical motion. Javier barked orders that were equal parts training and prayer. Miguel tried to steady the recorder and failed, the pen shaking in his grip. I remember small things from the first flush of the breach. The sound of glass breaking along a composite seam, a blue-white flash of something, an electrical arc that sent everyone ducking. There was a smell like ozone and something metallic. The red light strobed harder, painting faces in slices, making everything look like a war zone in miniature. We moved to lockdown corridors. The elevator was jammed between floors. Someone kicked at panels. Miguel yelled into the radio for an emergency lift override. Static answered him, then a clipped voice. Hold position. Await command. It was command speak that meant, we're considering theater-level moves. In the middle of the chaos, Cortez turned to Moreno and asked, quietly, is it chemical release? Moreno read the instruments that were still functional and shook his head. No, biological spike and negative pressure drop, he said. We need to isolate the eastern bank now. The eastern bank was where the older chambers clustered, the ones with the label stamped 1979. My hand hovered above the rail of the corridor, and I remember the wrongness of feeling possessed of a moral ledger I had not consented to. We were there to assess structure. We were there to sign a paper and leave. Instead, we were standing on the edge of a decision about living beings and boxes, and a language that had already labeled Ludfer's inventory. Then came the screaming. It wasn't a human scream at first. It was a sound that layered upon itself, a thin keening that threaded up into higher registers, layered with an animalistic clatter. Below it, a metallic thrum as if something inside a composite shell was striking for release. The technicians froze.
The men near the observation port stepped away as if the noise could reach through reinforced glass and find them. One of the units down the hall blew a safety valve, and a froth of vapor dumped across the corridor like cold fog.
Cortez and Moreno moved as if toward a point of triage. They conferred in hushed, fast sentences I couldn't parse. Then the lights flared and one of the outer doors buckled. The metal groaned in a way that sang of fatigue and neglected maintenance. A section of the ceiling panel tore loose and fell with a dust-swirling thud. Aluminum pieces shivered into the corridor. We had to act, not because we wanted to, but because the building was failing to maintain its pretense of order. Someone had to make the immediate choices. Javier started issuing commands that were tactical. Form a perimeter at the south corridor, take positions, keep civilians clear. He spoke like a man in a firefight, framing human beings into boxes of cover and sweep. The technical folks scrambled to seal doors with pressure clamps. The red lights snapped rhythmically like a warning heartbeat. As we moved, something moved in one of the rooms without light. It pushed against the reinforced window and left smear patterns that looked like prints but were neither like human fingerprints nor like animal paws. They were elongated, with ridged pads. The technicians recoiled. Someone shouted, "Shut it down," and an alarm answered, its knotty tone threading the whole facility into a single anxious sound. We made the call to the lift with 2 containment units and a skeleton crew. Colonel Hayes ordered that the transfer continue. Whatever chain of command lives beyond a soldier's immediate gaze had decided. They were going to move things out, presumably to a site with deeper authority, off-site and secure. They said the words like they were instructions. Hearing them felt like being handed the last piece of a puzzle you had not wanted. As we prepped for movement, something else happened on an ordinary utility corridor. A door that should have been welded solid shuddered open under internal pressure. A light bled through the crack, and above it something moved with purpose, not random. A silhouette passed in the doorway, upright and long-limbed. It did not run. It had a gait that suggested economy of motion, immediate but deliberate. For a beat, the corridor looked like a painting of light and shadow, and the silhouette paused and turned toward us like a spectator at a scene. I will never forget the way Javier leaned forward and hissed, "Shields," a word we used to mean protective formation. We moved as if into a protocol, human bodies acting on memory and muscle. The silhouette in the doorway lifted its head, and for reasons my training cannot explain, pointed with a hand that was long and fine in a gesture that slapped something inside me like recognition. It pointed and then vanished back into the darkness. The moment after it turned, an alarm on the far side of the facility started to tick faster. The environmental monitors went into a blackout as power strips overloaded and cycled. We were left in a core of red emergency light and the sound of men breathing too fast.
The transfer didn't finish. It couldn't. The containment module that had cracked vented, and the corridor filled with the thin cold of released agents. The techs sealed doors the way surgeons clamp arteries. We formed a human chain to carry what we could to the lift, but the scale of the problem had outgrown us. It was then that the command voice, remote, still measured, decided the only option that guaranteed control: demolition. The word came down over a secure channel that sounded ordinary and absolute at the same time. Demolition. It traveled through the room in the same clipped cadence as every other order. No flourish, no moral explanation, just the administrative rigor of a decision already made above our pay grade. Render the facility inert, the message said, in effect. Make sure nothing leaves the site. Contain the risk. Contain the liability. For a few seconds, the room emptied of speech. People looked at one another, searching for a different voice, a civilian authority who would veto, a higher-up who would suggest relocation. No one offered that voice. Cortez stood with his shoulders slumped as if the word itself had a weight he could not shoulder. Moreno's eyes were wet and raw at the rims. He fiddled with a pen as if it might be the only permitted outlet for emotion. Colonel Hayes, steady, unflinching, gave the logistical outline with the same flat professionalism he had used since the start. Charges placed at structural weak points, controlled collapse to prevent dispersal, observer teams at a secure ridge, all non-essential personnel clear. The language was clinical because it had to be. Clinical language obscures feeling and makes action practicable. Javier didn't speak right away. He is a man who sizes up risk like a geometric problem, and he had done the math in the space between the command and his next breath. "We lose evidence," he said finally, and his voice wasn't a complaint. It was an inventory. "We destroy what we walked into." "Or we stop whatever is leaking," Miguel said. He sounded younger in that sentence, like a man who still tried to believe the world could be fixed by a clear decision. If something escapes, we could be looking at casualties outside this facility. That was the frame the command had chosen. The calculus of risk favored obliteration over relocation. To the men in suits and the officers with sealed channels, it was the safest way to guarantee secrecy and to prevent any possibility of the specimens or their biological signatures reaching the public. To the engineers who understood how structures failed,
It was also a way to contain unknown stresses in a single manipulative burst. To the moralists among us, it felt like burial. I stood there and watched faces as they reconciled their training with their instinct. Training taught us to obey to prevent chaos.
Instinct told us to preserve the things we had just seen. Eyes that had met ours through glass, lives that had looked back. Where those two paths met, we hesitated and then followed orders. That is the habit of soldiers. We weigh our hesitation in private and then act in public. They moved quickly once the decision was made. Men who had been researchers minutes earlier transformed into technicians with sledgehammers. They marked support beams with chalk, drew diagrams on the backs of clipboards, and directed non-essential stat out of the inner perimeter. Teams went to work carving access to structural nodes where they would place charges engineered to bring the roof down inward. The plan, if you can call it graceful, was to collapse the main support columns, to create a controlled caving, a sinkhole, a premeditated ruin. I watched the charges being set because that was part of my role, to verify placements, to ensure safety for the men tasked with the work. The charges were small compared to the industrial demolitions I'd seen on training fields. They were precise. They were meant to fracture, to sever supports at pre-calculated points. There were men with welding torches and men in harnesses who threaded the charges through maintenance hatches, cued by the measured voices of structural engineers who had worked too long with the language of failure. No one cheered. There was no bravado. There was a focused, almost sterile efficiency. The technicians moved like surgeons, because in a way they were performing a last resort operation. We sealed off corridors. We moved the remaining specimens we could, what could be moved without violating the new directive, back into the inner sanctum. Some devices that had been wheeled in for the transfer were dismantled and stowed. Others were cannibalized for parts to reinforce a failed transfer carriage. Moreno stayed by the observation ports and watched the chambers under his breath, like a man who kept family pictures near him when he had to do something he knew would hurt those in the pictures. Before the final call, Moreno pulled me aside. He didn't speak loud. He leaned close enough for his breath to be another human detail. "Whatever you remember," he said, "write it down. Keep it where someone will find it if they ever look for the truth." There was a plea in it that was not military. It sounded like someone reaching for an anchor. I nodded. I didn't know whether I could. I promised myself that later I would try. We removed to an observation point a quarter-mile above the facility, behind a ridgeline where Colonel Hayes said the viewing angle would be safe. He set up a cluster of binoculars and a small portable camera. There were men with radios, the kind of quiet professionals who had no business showing emotion. Some of the techs wore respirators. Some had covers over their shoulders to shield from dust. And that ridge-top light with the western sun lowering, the facility's profile looked like a scar on the land, a flat roofline edged by service roads and satellite dishes that seemed to watch like an unblinking mouth. No one spoke much. Some tightened their jaw muscles against the tension. Others stared like men waiting for a verdict. I remember kissing the edge of my left hand, a habit from long months of prayerless concentration. No God answered me that day, only the wind. They initiated the charge sequence. It was like the countdown to a test, but with a moral echo. A handful of men in a command van ran through the final checks, confirmed sensor feeds, and awaited the authorization confirmation. The static on the radio felt louder than it had any right to. The colonel's face was a map of decisions. He checked the time, looked at us, and said simply, "This is the last chance to move away." No one did. At T-minus 30 seconds, the technicians pulled back to their vehicles, and the men at the ridge tightened their grips on the binoculars. The orders came through, soft and absolute. A hand signal, a whispered confirmation. It isn't theatrical the way movies do it. It is practiced and brisk. T-minus 10. I remember thinking in that strange, disconnected way people do in acute stress, that this would be a closed thing, that we would watch and catalog and then go home. That thought lasted until the charges went. The explosion is something you feel in the bones. Sound is only part of it. At the first detonation, there was an articulation in my jaw, as if I had been punched from inside. The air carried a sound like a pressure vessel breaking, and then layered under it, a rumble that translated itself into the ground beneath our boots. Dust rose in a column like a small storm, and the sky changed color for a heartbeat as particulate met light. The blast wave hit the ridge and pushed the small hairs on our arms outward. It carried with it the smell of hot metal and burnt plastic, an ozone bite, and a sour tang I couldn't name then and still can't now. The facility did not explode with the theatrical flourish of imploding buildings in movies.
It crumpled. You could see the roofline sag and then begin to fold in. Parts of the structure pancaked inward the way a hand might close on a small object. It was intentional. It was methodical. And despite the control, it felt grotesque. The controlled collapse turned into dust and shadow and a new absence. For a few seconds, everyone stood transfixed, as if force had frozen our faces. When the dust cloud cleared enough to see, much of the building's upper volumes had collapsed into an amorphous mound. The outer walls had buckled. Service roads that had been clear moments before were now choked with debris. The area smelled like concrete and burnt insulation. Small, white-hot glints of metal poked out of the rubble.
There was a mechanical, bureaucratic silence that followed, like the world taking a breath to see if anything would answer. We didn't find living things in the immediate wreckage. There were no cinematic survivors clambering out of the crater. The specimens we had seen were sealed inside their chambers, entombed beneath a tide of engineered rubble that had been designed to ensure no one could set them free with a crowbar and a prayer. Technicians in hazmat and heavy armor moved carefully through the outer fringes, taking seismic readings, measuring for volatile organics, and confirming what the plan had promised. The site was inert, contained, and collapsed. That was the official position. They put it in words, in memos, in the paperwork that would later be redacted. I stood at the ridge and watched men with instruments pick at the edges of a deliberate absence. Moreno was taken away in a vehicle shortly after the blast. He didn't look at me. He only gave a small, almost invisible nod as he was led into a white van with blacked-out windows. Cortez stayed behind and helped with the technical assessment. His mouth was a thin line as he filed reports. Colonel Hayes circled the area, speaking into a radio, and his voice had the uncompromising tone of someone who had just carried out an unpleasant but necessary program. The days after were blunted into a list of administrative procedures. We were ordered back onto buses and taken to a debriefing center that smelled of coffee and institutional vinyl. Men younger than me swore under their breath. Older men sat with the measured distance of those who had seen damage and assumed it would be contained on paper. We were strip-searched for contraband. Personal devices were taken, cameras and radios cataloged. Photographs any of us had taken were confiscated. I watched one of the techs flick through images, and then, without making eye contact, passed the storage card to an agent who sealed it into evidence. I asked about it. The agent said nothing beyond property secured. I had pockets of memory that were now potential evidence, and others that were merely in my head. That distinction would become important later. We were given forms and told the usual lines. This operation was classified. Unauthorized disclosure would be prosecuted to the full extent of applicable regulations. We signed with the automatic strokes men make when they know they have little leverage. The legal weight of an NDA is a blunt instrument. Its edges are meant to be felt. They told us the facility had been assessed and rendered safe, that all biological material had been accounted for, and that the site would be monitored indefinitely. They provided a narrative. Infrastructure failure forced a controlled demolition. There was neither admission nor denial of what had been stored below. The unit scattered. Some men returned to their previous assignments and never spoke of what had happened. Some took early retirement.
Miguel lasted another month on active duty. He developed insomnia and would call me at odd hours, whispering fragments of dreams where rooms opened and the things inside looked at him. He was reassigned to a logistics post in another state and eventually discharged with an honorable separation that was silent on the reasons why. Javier stayed in uniform longer than the rest of us. He was given another posting and then, months later, an administrative transfer that took him out of our chain of command. I heard rumors, quiet things, about some who had refused to sign the non-disclosure forms, being quietly encouraged to accept disability or early retirement. How much of that was hearsay, I cannot say. The practical effect was the same. The men who had been eyewitnesses dispersed, their collective memory fragmented by orders and life. Cortez remained in program oversight for some time, his name appearing on dry memos that filtered through a network of scientific institutions. He continued to publish in a narrow field, with articles that avoided the subject we had known, and leaned into chemistry and material science, as if that were a natural place to hide. Moreno vanished from public view. Once, by chance, I saw him at a small cafe outside a base, folded into the corner with his head down and a paper cup in his hands. He did not see me. That sight of him, diminished, is one of the memories I carry with a particular tenderness. He had looked like the man who understood the moral weight of what we had done and could not live with the neat permission structure that had justified it. My own discharge came sooner than I expected. I submitted paperwork citing reasons that were true, personal, and was relieved of duty within weeks. The official forms were clean. The administrative language treated me like a soldier who had done his job and asked to leave. In private, men who had been my superiors suggested that the stress of the mission was a risk to readiness, and that a voluntary separation benefited both the service and me. The fact that I left with little fanfare and a head full of questions suited the institution. Institutions prefer to turn difficult things into tidy files. I took the pieces that weren't seized. I had a notepad with careful logs, some sketches of the floor plan, and a document that recorded the timestamps of our environmental monitors as they climbed from green to yellow to orange to red. Those pages felt like contraband. I kept them folded in a heavy cedar box I still own. Once, on a winter night, I thumbed through them with a flashlight, and the paper seemed to whisper. Paper has a way of holding on to timelines even when the people who lived them have been moved. The moral aftermath followed me in ways I could not have anticipated. I dreamed in containment protocols. The sound of red emergency strobes was a drum that translated into the same physiologic unease I felt at the sight of flashing police lights.
I woke with the taste of metallic air in my mouth. In daylight, the world seemed more slapdash, as if the act of burying something with calculated precision left the landscape morally pocked. People ask me, sometimes, why I speak now. It is a simple answer and a complicated one. The simple part, silence felt like complicity. If you are a witness to something that matters, and you bury the memory inside bureaucracy and forgetfulness, then the burial becomes part of the crime. The complicated part, truth has a way of making people uncomfortable because it dissolves the tidy decisions of power. When you tell someone what you saw, an alive, aware being behind glass, the scent on the air when a containment module failed, you force them to reconcile their sense of safety with the possibility of limits in what authorities will do in the name of safety. Ethically, I still wrestle. The people on the other side of the glass, if you can call them people, were not in my custody to make a moral decision for. They were, by every definition that matters to a soldier's conscience, living beings. They had eyes that met mine and a gaze that seemed to process me as more than a threat. Confinement is something we know how to do well. We lock, we label, we file away. But locking sentient beings away and then choosing to bury them under a heap of rubble is policy. That is not containment. That is erasure. It is the most administrative of violences. Part of me understands the strategic logic behind the demolition decision. If you assume prudence is defined by the likelihood of broader harm, then removing the possibility of exposure seems defensive. But part of me cannot let go of the sense that we made a moral shortcut. We chose the certainty of burying a thing over the uncertainty of trying to understand it ethically. We closed the book instead of conducting the hard work of opening it wide and taking responsibility for whatever came next. Sometimes, at night, I imagine a future excavation, a team with better instruments and clearer motives, peeling back the layers of collapse and finding the chambers we buried. I do not know whether that is a hope or hazard. I know the possibility disturbs me. If those beings, or whatever they are, survived the collapse, what would they be like now? Would they be dormant, a fossilized imprint of something we once panicked at? Would they be altered by confinement? Would they be in pain? Those questions have no satisfying answers, and that is part of why the memory gnaws. There are practical things I know. The government closed the site, installed monitoring, and set administrative controls to limit research disclosure. The official story was kept small and phrased in terms of public safety. Evidence was secured, and individuals involved were given the legal framework to keep silent. That framework is effective in the short term. Its long-term efficacy depends on the people it touches.
Men move on, documents degrade, and truths that are seared into human memory persist in ways that paperwork cannot entirely kill. People sometimes ask whether what we encountered was extraterrestrial. I will not assert that. I didn't have the institutional clearance to make such a pronouncement. I had only a pair of human eyes and a set of instruments calibrated to atmospheric and particulate thresholds. What I can say is this: the specimens were biologically active, they responded in patterns that suggested cognition, and they were kept in environments and under safeguards consistent with living organisms rather than preserved artifacts. The origin of their biology was unknown to the researchers, whose vocabulary always circled back to phrases like unknown origin and legacy containment. In the absence of conclusive evidence, that is the truth I own. Unknown, not labeled, and treated with the bureaucratic practices that flatten the moral eccentricities of life into manageability. Years passed. The crater healed over with time, slowly with the help of bulldozers and an administrative story that framed the site as an old structural hazard that had been remediated. There are places in that region where the land bears no trace of what happened, except those of us who still have the memory. The people who live nearby, farmers, hunters, folks who would not cross a wire in normal times, tell different stories. A sudden boom, a day of dust and strange air, men in blacked-out vans. Their versions are fragments that align with what we lived because people file the weird the same ways, as folklore, as rumors, as the kind of thing you tell to keep yourself alert. The last time I returned to the ridge, I expected to feel something like closure. Instead, I felt a sediments of time pressure, memories layered over memory, like pages pressed together in a book. The land looked smaller, and yet the moral footprint felt enormous. Standing on the ridge, with winter shrinking the vegetation into neat brown cords, I felt the old intimacy with the world, that the sky is not only a vault, but a record. I thought about the eyes behind glass, and the ways in which a gaze can be an indictment. If I have a final admonition, it is this: burying something does not erase what it once was, and burying as policy is not the same as solving a problem. The facility was rendered inert physically and politically. Those are two different actions. The physical burying might have prevented an immediate hazard. The political burying, where files are redacted and men are cowed into silence under the threat of legal action, creates a different sort of hazard, the hazard of an unexamined choice. Institutions that choose secrecy over transparency may do so with the best of intentions, but intentions are thin armor against the slow accrual of wrongs. I have kept the records I could and written down what I remember.
I do not know whether anyone will read this and take up the work of excavation, whether literal or archival. I can't predict whether one day someone will pry open the sealed files and remote sensor logs and say with technical authority what we only hinted at then. What I can say in the clearest possible terms is what my eyes saw and what my conscience still tests me with. We discovered living, responsive specimens, contained and cataloged. And when containment failed in a way command could not tolerate, the military chose to bury the facility rather than risk an uncontrolled disclosure. That burial was physical and administrative. It was intended to close the chapter, but in the act of closing it, it left a stain of unanswered moral questions. I don't offer this as a call to conspiracy. I offer it as testimony. Witnesses carry memories like wounds. They ache in particular weather, they scar, and they sometimes weep unexpectedly. I have told my story because the alternative is to let institutional narratives stand unchallenged. Some things deserve to be known, not because knowledge is a weapon, but because it is a form of accountability. If you believe that buried truths should be examined rather than silenced, share this account. If you think institutions should be asked difficult questions about ethics and containment, pass this along. There are people who will prefer the comfort of a sealed record. There are others who will prefer the discomfort of inquiry. Decide which side you are on. And if you ever stand on a ridge and look down at a place that seems like a wound in the earth, remember that not all wounds were caused by nature. Some were made by choices, and choices have consequences that outlast the men who made them. What U.S. soldiers discovered during that classified Appalachian mission in 1979 was buried, both under tons of concrete and under rules meant to keep the world complacent. The site rests now where we devised it to lie in silence, but silence is a tenuous thing. Memory is not so easily entombed. Share this, preserve what you can, and remember the cost of choosing burial over understanding.